to say I will abuse you guys and embarrass Charlie because I asked him if he was able to give an update or an introduction to himself before we started today, and he assured me he did. But I know he didn't tell you everything.
We'll talk into the microphone.
Sorry, yeah. So Charlie worked with the group in NRCS. If you're not familiar with it, it's Conservation Effects Assessment Project. They are the group of technical experts within NRCS who evaluate our conservation actions across the United States. Yes, our partners do it, yes. Charlie is a wildlife lead, so many of the people that you heard talk today are people who have collaborated with Charlie on evaluating NRCS practices. The plug I'm going to give is look up Conservation Effects Assessment Project. Charlie puts together an exceptionally wonderful website that lists all of the projects he's done over time, not only the publications, the final reports that are there, but he produces a document that's called a Conservation Insight. So there's a number of them back there, so you can get an example, and I know it'll wet your whistle. But they actually take that data and put it into sort of a management context that our agency scientists can use to sort of implement our programs even better. So. And yes, I should say, from that conservation insight, very frequently through our Working Lands for Wildlife program, we create another document with this called a Science to Solutions document. So if you think about, sort of a refereed journal, it's our scientists talking to scientists, right? Researchers to researchers. Conservation insights are, research talking to land managers. The people who are technical experts, but maybe aren't going to dive deep in the literature on everything. And then these Science to Solutions take that same information and present it in a format that is available to landowners. Really, any partner that you could want. It has the pretty pictures. It has, the narratives and interviews with landowners very frequently, the ones that allow us to use their lands. So there's multiple formats in which all of these documents are presented. So with that, I won't torture him anymore.
Thanks, Melissa. Now I get to introduce you. The last talk of the day was supposed to be Laura Lukens from the Monarch joint venture, but she couldn't be here. So Melissa Martin, our science advisor for Working Lands for Wildlife in the East, will give that presentation. So state of monarch habitat in Midwestern ag landscapes.
And so this is the back and forth?
Yeah, well, this size, and this is the laser pointer.
Laser pointer. All right, sounds good. So as Charlie mentioned, listed on the slide are very loosely termed co-authors. Laura and Kyle actually put this presentation together. I looked over it about a week ago. So if you love it, they get all the credit. If you hate it, it was most likely my presentation of their work. Before I get started, I'm going to give you a 30-second intro into monarchs. I very regularly hesitate to do this because it's such an iconic species. I often run into people who know way more than I do about it, and I'm talking to them about it. But monarch is the guy you see on the left. That's the one that your kids raise in their classes in kindergarten, same guy. It's one of those really cool species that does an annual long-range migration. So adult monarch butterflies that are in southern Canada and the upper Midwest, every fall, those specific adult butterflies fly all the way down south through the central U.S. If you're familiar with that part of the country, it's the I-35 corridor. They follow all of our shipping trucks down into Texas and then eventually into Mexico, where they spend the winter in forests down in Mexico. When the spring comes back around, those same adults pack up their bags and head back up north. This time they start to reproduce, and it's a multi-generational migration back up to the north. As we have discussed for many of the other species today, monarch populations have been declining significantly in recent years. If you think about that central flyway that we just discussed, it overlaps with many of the species we've talked about today, and loss of habitat for monarchs in that central flyway has been linked to the decline of the population, definitely. As we discussed today, a lot of that central flyway is private lands, and specifically private working lands. So back in 2015, NRCS, through the Working Lands for Wildlife program, chose the monarch butterfly as the ACE species of national interest for the Working Lands for Wildlife partnership. And so as we began that partnership, we very logically recognized that USDA has been working for pollinators for decades, right? This is not a new effort. This is just an effort to expand our existing pollinator work to see if we can address some of the habitat needs of monarch butterflies specifically. And so we reached out to our colleagues at Monarch Joint Venture to ask the question, hey, how are our existing pollinator efforts in USDA affecting monarch habitats? And through that cooperative agreement with the Monarch Joint Venture, we were able to identify their existing partners in the Conservation Reserve Program. If you have been in the symposium all day, it's the same one that Dave and Dan talked about earlier today. It's just if Dave and Dan were talking about grazing lands that were then converted to conservation lands, these are primarily in the upper Midwest row crop that is converted to conservation lands. So for this effort, we were able to identify 39 sites that were current and former CRP lands. We visited these sites 4 to 5 times during the growing season, which is May through September, in the region that we were talking about, which is Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. We were interested in collecting habitat data as well as monarch data. So in terms of habitat, of course, on the bottom left, you're looking at milkweed. That is, of course, important because it is the sole food source for monarch larvae. If it's not there, you don't get any baby monarchs. And on the left, you have our blooming plants, which are, of course, the main food source for adult monarchs. So if you don't have those, you're not getting any monarchs. And of course, as much as NRCS is only responsible for putting the plants in the ground, creating the conservation opportunity, we were hoping and we did want to measure whether or not monarchs were actually using those lands, actually finding the conservation we created. Laura and Kyle and her colleagues also did interviews with landowners during this process. Through that process, they were able to get information on the seeding that had been done on that property, both what the seed mix was and when it was done and how it was done, as well as the history of the site, so what it was before it became agricultural conservation. They also collected management information, so after it became agricultural conservation, what had been done to maintain that land. So what we found is that about 80% of the sites, those 39 sites, were in corn and soybean. The sites were aged 1 to 22 years. They were between 3 and 94 acres in terms of size. And if the site was planted, that seed mix had between 4 and 64 forb species present in it. In terms of management, 72% of the sites had been burned. Every site that was older than 5 years had been burned at least once. 72% of the sites had also been mowed at some time. About a third of the sites had herbicides applied to the site in order to control invasive species. And about 20% of the sites had been reseeded in the site history to achieve goals. So first, as I mentioned, we wanted to see if we got milkweed on the site. The good news is we did. 38 of the 39 sites had milkweed present on the site. The 4 species that you see here are the species that we actually saw: common milkweed, butterfly milkweed. Oops, I have a pointer. Butterfly milkweed, world milkweed, and swamp milkweed. I mentioned that they were present on 38 of the 39 sites. I will skip forward a little bit and tell you only 24 of those sites were actually planted. So we actually found milkweed on sites that did not have milkweed planted on them, 17 of the sites. Digging a little deeper into that data, on this figure, you see on the x-axis those 4 species that we actually monitored on the site. Your y-axis is the number of sites. The blue bars that you're looking at are if the species was planted and we saw it. The white is if it was planted and we didn't see it, and the green is if we didn't plant it and we saw it. So first, common milkweed is the first bar you see there on the left-hand side of the screen. Almost every site that had common milkweed planted, you got it, so 12 out of 13. It was also found on an additional 25 sites where it was not planted. Your second bar there indicates your swamp milkweed. It showed up in every site it was planted, as well as an additional 17 sites where it wasn't planted. Butterfly milkweed showed up in about half of the sites where we planted it, and an additional 4. And firmly bringing up the rear is world milkweed, which did not show up in any of the sites where it was planted, but did show up in 4 sites where it was not. That's presence, so moving into density. On average, we had 600 milkweed stems per acre. That's a median of about 350 stems per acre, and our range was 0 to about 6,800. So putting that in the context of like the larger monarch conservation effort, the current goal for monarchs is 200 stems per acre. There has been some recent work actually done by Kyle Chastain, who is on this, is one of the co-authors of the presentation, that showed that there is a relationship in rights-of-ways between the density of immatures found and the density of milkweed stems up to 2,000 stems per acre. But even, if you go with the 200 or 2,000, our sites are within that range for the monarch conservation goals. So combining the milkweed presence and density information, we were able to answer two questions. Is milkweed more likely to be present at sites where it's planted? And is milkweed density higher at sites where it was planted? So first, our two most common milkweed species across the sites were common milkweed and swamp milkweed. However, it is the second two sites, I'll go back one, are butterfly milkweed and swamp milkweed that actually were present at higher densities and were seen more often if they were planted. Common milkweed showed up whether or not you planted it. It likes it. It likes our lands, which is good news. Swamp milkweed was actually the only species that responded to seeding density. So the more seeds you put into the mix, the more swamp milkweed you got. And of course, as I mentioned, there is still some knowledge to be gained about what is going on with world milkweed plantings. We also looked at our common forb species. You can see them listed here on the left or on the right. I won't read through all those. You can look at the pretty pictures on the left, though, as I tell you that our two most common species were black-eyed Susan and daisy fleabane. Don't look too closely, but number 4 is the guy who keeps disappearing, which is Canada thistle. If you are familiar with the upper Midwest, that is not a surprise. Canada thistle is, however, a good pollinator species. Many other issues associated with its presence, however. I am not advocating introducing Canada thistle anywhere. We also looked at the blooming species that were present throughout the growing season. In this image, you see on the x-axis the dates that we actually sampled, May through September for the growing season, and on the y-axis, you have the number of blooming species. It looks more like aquamarine at the moment to me, but our green bars are all of the species that were actually measured on site, and the purple bars are only the species that were planted. What you can see is that on the left-hand side of the screen, during our May time period is where we had the lowest number of blooming species present on site. And the number of blooming species did increase throughout the growing season through the late summer. This is good news, right? Especially in that late summer period is when the adult monarchs are trying to fatten themselves up to get ready for that long haul south. So having a lot of nectaring opportunities available to them on these conservation lands is definitely a benefit. So digging down deep into those blooming species, there was a total of 42 species observed on the sites. For the sites that were planted, 27 species were actually planted. Of those, 14 were observed. So we have an establishment rate of about 50% for the species that were actually planted. One of the other interesting facts that we saw is that although more forb species were present when you had a higher diversity mix, the establishment rate did not increase with a high diversity seed mix. So if you get, in this case, we're using 40 seeds per acre as a high diversity, or 40 species per acre as a high diversity mix. And so using those higher diversity mixes did not lead to greater establishment. Before we dive off the deep end with that finding, there is a lot of work out there that shows that higher diversity seed mixes actually give you that broader diversity of blooming plants throughout the growing season. So establishment is not the only thing to focus on when deciding whether or not you're going to invest in a higher diversity mix, right? There are definitely other benefits to the species. And then finally, we evaluated all of these habitat characteristics, but wanted to know if monarchs were present on those sites. And the good news is they are, definitely. So 30 of the 39 sites had the juvenile phase, so they were using those milkweed resources that we just discussed. And 37 of the 39 sites had adult monarchs, so they were using those nectaring plants that we just discussed. I'll take a short time out. If you're not familiar with monarchs, I'll just remind you that this was done as 2016 and 17, which are two of the lowest years for monarch populations in recent histories. So, and just happened to be when we did this study, right? Of course. The fact that we actually had monarchs on the site was not only a relief, but definitely good to see, especially in the times where we know that the population was at a low level. We also observed about 350 adult monarchs on the sites throughout the 4 to 5 sampling periods. Took some pretty pictures just to prove it, but they were definitely using those nectaring resources. So what does this all mean? I think the good news is that our agricultural conservation, in this case, what is done through the CRP program, is providing habitats that pollinators can use, and we have evidence that the pollinators are using it. It did point to some potential opportunities to improve the way that we're implementing that conservation. So, for example, if you think about the milkweed species, do we really need to put common milkweed seeds in our seed mix if it's going to show up anyway? And do we want to focus on a species like swamp milkweed, maybe, that you get 100% establishment? You find it in all the sites. Of course, we're focusing on a small geographic range here compared to the larger monarch population range, but we're also interested in finding out, what those barriers to establishment for world milkweed are. Are they, site-specific factors, or do those have to do with, techniques that are used to implement the practice? So lots of work to do moving forward. With that, if you guys are interested in additional work, Kyle and Laura still work at the Monarch Joint Venture. The Monarch Joint Venture is the group that developed the integrated monarch monitoring protocol. Their website is spectacular. If you're interested in the methodologies, they have a rapid assessment program and a more robust program. I always say it's we use the Honda Civic version of the monitoring protocol, and that, if you're a bug person, you can use the Cadillac. They have it. And they have training resources for people of all skill levels. So I would encourage you to reach out to them. And then we will either release you, or I think I have 1 minute. Yeah, I know. Hey, Kelsey.
Oh yes, sorry. I think I'm wrong, but in the beginning, did you say that they had different management regimes? So the different sites that you were looking at were either mowed or they weren't all done in the same time.
Right.
Did you look for any association between disturbance and milkweed presence abundance? Because common milkweeds and disturbance plants.
100%.
So since they weren't all the same.
Right. Yeah, and I'll point you to, I don't know if it's out yet, but the Monarch Joint Venture, Kyle, Karen Oberhauser, have an article that's coming out. I think it's Frontiers. You probably know the one that I'm talking about, right? And so they went in depth on all of that. And so they have models associated with that, just for time. We didn't talk about it today. But definitely the challenge, of course, is that we are relying on landowner reporting. Right. Yeah, exactly. And so not always, right? Sometimes we have partners who keep, wonderful records that, you could take to the bank, right? But especially in our older CRP sites, sometimes they had changed ownership a number of times. So I think there were definitely some interesting findings that pointed to exactly the mechanisms that you're talking about and relationships between not only the milkweed actual presence, but blooming plants, right? And so, but they definitely had some interesting insights, but maybe not, as robust relationships, with the small sample size and, longer time periods. And, age of site was different too, right? So time since planting, you would be thinking about whether or not the sites had even established and were ready to mow and all those sort of, I'm preaching to the choir. Yeah.
Great talk.
Thanks.
Awesome. Did you guys collect data on bees by any chance?
Yes, the answer is yes. They did collect some sort of parallel data on other insects that were used, but not to the level of this. You know, it was more anecdotal presence, you know, that kind of, yeah.
Well, that's really good. And the reason I asked, so follow up comment, I guess, I was really struck by your graph that showed when things were blooming and you had that peak
Oh, yeah.
in like August, September. And with honeybees anyway, that's increasingly recognized as a period that's kind of commonly called the summer dearth, when there's very few floral resources. And maybe there's something special going on in these lands where this might provide that resource during the time of need.
Yeah, no, that would be great. Yeah. I think there was one more. Am I holding everybody up? I won't do that to you, I promise. Okay.
You still have 4 minutes.
Okay.
Of the species that you didn't plant that you found, do you have a sense of how many were invasive?
That we didn't plant that we found. Oh, and so I can take it back. These are the most common. The rest of them were found at lower abundance. The largest invasive that was present was definitely Canada thistle. And just to be clear, are we talking non-native or invasive? Okay, non-native. Yeah. And so I'm looking over here. Yeah, because red clover, I mean, I don't know how you'd classify that. But yeah, I think there probably were. I don't have the species list in my head, all 42. But I can definitely follow up with you if you're interested. I know Kyle and Laura would have that information in their heads right away. But I would be shocked to find out that Canada thistle was our only invasive plant.
But the main goal of this is particularly for pollinators, so that's a less important objective, I think.
CRP is actually administered through a separate agency. Those lands have multiple resource objectives, right? And so today we're just talking about pollinators. In terms of, as we heard today, right, how many species that we heard about today rely on the same exact landscape for habitat? And so I think what I would say is that what we're trying to create is good habitat for multiple resource areas, not just wildlife, but also water quality, erosion, and the introduction of non-native plants definitely impacts all of those aspects of the ecosystem. We're not evaluated in this study, but Canada thistle probably being, as we talk about grazing lands, as we did earlier today, Canada thistle is definitely not good news for grazing. While you do find bees on it, I would, again, not encouraging planting of Canada thistle. My husband used to do research on Canada thistle, so somewhere he's very uncomfortable right now.
Any other questions? Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, guys.